You.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Sexual Harassment and Precarious Workplaces. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. We bring you this webinar from the Knowledge Hub, funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and from the Learning Network, funded by the Ministry of the Status of Women, Government of Ontario. We're delighted to have Dr. Kaitlyn Matulewicz present this webinar. And I know that you're going to learn so much from Kaitlyn. We had over 350 people register for this webinar, which really speaks to the timeliness and the importance of this topic. Before I introduce Kaitlyn, I would like to draw your attention to a training program that is part of the Ontario government's It's Never Okay initiative aimed towards sexual harassment and violence awareness. The program, some of you may have heard of it, is It's Your Shift, and it's a training program to prevent sexual harassment and is tailored to the hospitality industry. It's Your Shift was developed by the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association, Ontario Tourism Education Corporation, and Tourism HR Canada. We hope to bring you a webinar on this exciting program in the near future, a part 2, if you will, of today's webinar, so stay tuned. Our team was thrilled when Dr. Kaitlyn Matulewicz agreed to share her research and knowledge on sexual harassment and precarious workplaces. A little bit about Kaitlyn: she lives and works on the West Coast in Lekwungen Territories, often called Victoria, BC. She's an organizer with the Retail Action Network, a direct action group fighting for workplace justice and better working conditions for retail, food service, and hospitality workers. Kaitlyn received her PhD from the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, where she researched women's experiences of sexual harassment in the British Columbia restaurant industry. We have some special ties to Kaitlyn here in Ontario because Kaitlyn grew up in Ontario and she attended York University. And while she was attending York University, she worked in the restaurant industry for 7 years. And I think, as you'll hear, some of those experiences really inspired and gave incentive to Kaitlyn to do the work that she's making her mark in now. So Kaitlyn, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you. But first, I just want to remind those who haven't participated in one of our webinars before that our format, Kaitlyn will speak for about 1 hour, and during her presentation, you can type any questions or comments that you may have. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have approximately 15 minutes to present some of those questions, as many as we can, to Kaitlyn for her response. I also wanted to let everyone know that the presentation itself will be recorded and will be posted on the Knowledge Hub and the Learning Network websites, and also the slides that you're seeing will be available in both English and French. And Sarah Mohammed tells us that they will be posted and ready for you to access on Monday, January 29th. So wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. The final thing is that in order to keep bringing you informative, timely webinars, we need your feedback. And at the end of the webinar, there will be a link for you to go and complete an evaluation, and that we roll those up and discuss them and plan accordingly as we move forward. We also wanted to let you know that once in a while, there may be voice irregularity, and that's just technology, and it will right itself very quickly. So with that, Kaitlyn, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you for inviting me to talk. It's a pleasure to be a part of this online community, and I look forward to and welcome some dialogue at the end of the presentation, and I'm excited to hear about what folks are working on in other jurisdictions related to this as well, and definitely look forward to the webinar on It's Your Shift. So today, my talk is on sexual harassment and precarious work, and we'll be exploring this topic by zooming in and looking at the full-service restaurant industry and women's uncomfortable or unwanted sexual interactions and sexual harassment they experience in the full-service restaurant industry in BC. And by full-service restaurants, I just mean to distinguish restaurants where customers typically order, eat their meal, and pay before leaving, rather than fast food restaurants. So my research was focused on full service. And what I'll be presenting, as Linda mentioned, comes out of my doctoral work at the University of Victoria when I was studying this topic using a law and society lens. So exploring law in relationship to its broader social relations. I'd like to start us off. Just trying to switch the slide. Let me see.
Sorry, Kaitlyn, we might have just to try this one more time.
Okay, no worries. There we go. Sarah, if it doesn't work, pulling the slides on my end, I could also maybe ask you to change it for me when I need to. Okay.
Okay.
So it didn't work on my end, but maybe can I just ask you to?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. Perfect. So I just wanted to start us off with these two quotations. The quote on the left is a frequently cited passage from the landmark Supreme Court of Canada case Jansen versus Platty from 1989. And this case involved two complaints from two women who worked at a restaurant in Winnipeg as waitresses, Diana Jansen and Tracy Govero. And these women face verbal and physical sexual harassment from a cook. And this is a landmark precedent-setting case because it is a case in which the Supreme Court found sexual harassment to be an illegal form of sex discrimination that violates provincial and federal human rights legislation. And I'll just read the quote for us. The quote says, "When sexual harassment occurs in the workplace, it is an abuse of both economic and sexual power. Sexual harassment is a demeaning practice, one that constitutes a profound affront to the dignity of employees forced to endure it. By requiring an employee to contend with unwelcome sexual actions or explicit sexual demands, sexual harassment in the workplace attacks the dignity and self-respect of the victim, both as an employee and as a human being." And how powerful these words are. The quote on the right comes from an interview I did with a woman, Emily, who will name Emily. All of these names are pseudonyms. And at the time of the interview, Emily was working as a server and bartender. In speaking about her work, Emily shared, "In a restaurant, particularly when I'm bartending, there's a lot of bending over. And that's honestly the most common, 'Oh, I like it when you bend over.' When I was talking about people not being original, I have heard that so much. That's nothing to me." And together the quotations draw our attention and call attention to the interface between law and society. They also highlight the disjuncture between the legal treatment of sexual harassment on the one hand and the everyday experiences of women working in the restaurant industry who face being subjected to sexist comments, sexual remarks or jokes, being asked out or outright propositioned, and general sexualized expectations about how they are to dress, look, and be at work. As Emily puts it, sexual innuendos are an ordinary part of her work. As she says, that's nothing to me. And Sarah, could you just switch the slide, please? Thank you, awesome. So here's the outline for today's presentation. We'll begin with a bit of background on workplace sexual harassment, and this is probably familiar to a lot of people in on this webinar. But we'll talk about the origins of sexual harassment and the legal treatment of sexual harassment. And then we'll go into a case study focusing on restaurant work and women's experiences of sexual harassment. I'll talk about some of the background, what brought me to the research approach I used, the purpose and methods, and a bit on some important things to keep in mind when it comes to the BC context of this work. Then we'll go on to a talk about precarious work and human rights and sexual harassment and how they relate. We'll look at the organization of restaurant work and how, as I argue, sexual harassment becomes institutionalized and embedded in the work processes. We'll end by looking at some projects of resistance, and then we'll have some closing remarks, and I look forward to your questions. And slide. Thank you. So here we are, sexual harassment. Before the problem of sexual harassment was named sex discrimination and had a legal definition, the term sexual harassment emerged from the practice of consciousness raising and women voicing their experiences of paid work. In North America, the first use of the phrase sexual harassment has been traced to feminist activists working out of Ithaca, New York, around 1975. And at the time, women had been struggling to articulate and find a language that captured the behavior of men at work that they found uncomfortable. The American magazine Ms. is often credited for making sexual harassment a household phrase after devoting a 1977 issue to the topic. And I was in a coffee shop the other day and noticed that Ms. Magazine's current cover reads "Smash the Patriarchy," and on the inside there's a feature story about the Weinstein effect. So I thought that was interesting, the resemblance between then and what we're going through right now. Shortly after the Ms. Magazine was published came pioneering work from Constance Backhouse and Leah Cohen in Canada, and Lynn Farley and Catherine McKinnon in the US. The Secret Oppression, which was published by Backhouse and Cohen, was groundbreaking work that pulled together research on women's accounts of unwanted sexual attention from men at work. They shared experiences from exotic dancers to government workers, and a strong theme throughout the book was highlighting the omnipresent problem. Any woman could be subjected to sexually harassing practices from managers, coworkers, and even customers and clients. The material context within which women's experiences happened in both paid work and society broadly was seen as crucial to understanding sexual harassment as a systemic problem. Also key to understanding how sexual harassment was happening was viewing it as being symptomatic of broader gender and economic relations of power. And conceptualizing sexual harassment in this way was pivotal, and at the time challenged discourses that excused sexual harassment as a form of courtship, tied to men's inevitable sexual desires. And this framing, a broad conceptual framing that connected to the roots of sexual harassment, challenged a very individualistic approach to sexual harassment, a view that it's something that's done by only a few bad apples. And we're still, of course, wrestling with these myths of sexual harassment. Thank you. Okay, so sexual harassment and law. Beyond publicly naming women's uncomfortable experiences in employment, feminist legal activists push for the recognition of sexual harassment within a legal framework. In writing The Secret Oppression, Backhouse and Cohen were tasked to demystify the law for their audience, and their hope was that law could be a powerful tool for changing women's experiences in paid work. And while they were hopeful about the promise of law as an instrument, they also recognized that this dominant male perspective permeated law and legal institutions. So this slide just provides a snapshot of some of the milestone sexual harassment cases. And I don't have time to go into great depth here about all the cases, but I think it's noteworthy that restaurants as a workplace are a common feature in a few of them. And you see that a lot with other sexual harassment cases as well. So the first one we have here is Bell versus Lattice, and it's a case from 1980. And this case is important because it is the first instance in which a board of inquiry, human rights board, determined that sexual harassment was a prohibited form of sex discrimination. And this case comes out of Ontario, and it involved two, again, waitresses who were subjected to verbal and physical forms of sexual harassment from their boss. And if you read the decision from the Board of Inquiry, it's full of very powerful statements about the promise of law in combating sexual harassment in the workplace. And it's a case that's celebrated as a victory for deciding such an important legal question. And in doing so, recognizing women's experiences of sexual harassment as a legal harm. And after the Bell case, commissions and human rights commissions and human rights tribunals across Canada followed Bell, and a few jurisdictions also amended their provincial human rights codes to explicitly protect against sexual harassment. Another huge development in sexual harassment law came with the introduction of employer liability for sexual harassment committed against its employees. Employer liability was first encompassed in sexually harassing practices of employers, and it was later extended to practices of supervisory employees, coworkers, and third parties, including customers. And that is the 1987 Robichaud case. Then we have 1989, we have the Jansen decision that I cited earlier and I spoke about. So I won't go into much detail again here, but just to note that again, another restaurant. Human rights tribunals have also found sexualized dress code requirements based on sex to be a prohibited form of sex discrimination. And the last case mentioned here, Motu, is a 2004 case from the BC Human Rights Tribunal that involved a nightclub. Andrea Motu was a server at a nightclub where the regular dress code was to wear a black shirt and black pants or black skirt. But on one evening in particular, the nightclub hosted a beach-themed fundraiser, and the female servers were instructed to dress in a bikini top and a sarong or surfer shorts. Meanwhile, the bartenders, who were men, were just told to wear a Hawaiian shirt and regular shorts. So Motu was scheduled to work the fundraiser and protested the dress requirement. And as a result of her refusal to wear a bikini top and the sarong, her serving section, which would have normally been at the front of the bar where there were lots of customers, where she would sell the feature drink and have high volume of sales and consequently high volume of tips, rather than being given that section, she was moved to the back of the restaurant, working in a dark corner and given a drink option, a drink feature to sell that was a cooler or something that had been discontinued from the menu. So, obviously that impacted her sales, that impacted her tips, and her work hours were also cut. And in that case, the tribunal found the dress code to be discriminatory, and also talks pretty significantly about the impact of tips on the server's income. So in less than 2 decades, sexual harassment went from being a problem that had no legal recognition to an illegal form of sex discrimination for which tribunals can assign employer liability for acts that include sexually harassing acts from supervisors, employers, coworkers, and even customers. However, with all of these important legal victories in the area of sexual harassment law, as we know, sexual harassment is still a big problem for people in paid work. So what has happened? And we'll just go to the next slide here. What's happened? So feminist lawyers and legal scholars have really wrestled with this question, and a few answers that are given are, that there's a problem with the way in which law defines sexual harassment as unwelcome conduct, portraying sexual harassment as, a misunderstood reading of a situation that would have otherwise been consensual, and a critique of law that individualizes the problem, and in doing so downplays the economic power dynamics involved in sexual harassment in the workplace. There's also critiques of the legal tests in which law defines unwelcome behavior. So whether or not something is known or comes to be known in law as unwelcome is often articulated in terms of whether or not the alleged harasser knew or ought to have known that the conduct was unwelcome. And this is heavily critiqued in that it often evaluates the conduct in question from the perpetrator's perspective, which means that the dominant kind of male norms in a workplace and those cultural norms remain unchallenged. And there are a lot of other limitations that feminist lawyers and scholars have brought to light in their analysis of sexual harassment law over the years that I won't go into here. But given the limitations, legal scholar Colleen Shepherd has called for a systemic approach to sexual harassment that really interrogates the institutional context within which sexual harassment is institutionalized as normal. And she suggested that this investigation go back and start with the experiential knowledge of those who live sexual harassment. Thank you. All right, so here's the part in the presentation where we're going to go into the case study and specifically look at restaurant work and what my research found. I'll give a little bit of a background, a personal background. As Linda had mentioned, I spent 7 years working in the restaurant industry in Ontario. At 14, I was hired to work as a hostess in Mississauga. And I worked there I worked in restaurants all through high school and through my undergrad, as many college and university students do. In my time in the industry was the kind of window into this topic. During my years in the industry, sexual and sexist comments from customers, coworkers, and managers was common. As a young teenager, being a hostess and being required to open the door for any customer coming or leaving the restaurant, I quickly became accustomed to remarks thrown at me by men. Ones that stand out are comments about how they'd like to take me or my coworker home with them. Sexual harassment also came from managers. I remember one, manager in particular who would often ask me when my birthday was because he wanted to know when I would be quote unquote legal. And at this time I was 16 years old, and he was 40, in his 40s, and my manager. And these experiences were not unusual. I had many friends and family members who also worked in restaurants and had similar stories of their own. And these things just seemed to happen to girls and women worked in the restaurant. It was just the normal, the way it was, essentially. In 2 restaurants I worked in, I was told to dress in a sexy business casual manner, and in one, in the other example, to dress in a quote unquote classy provocative manner. And this was a little later in my years in the restaurant industry, and with those comments, it was very hard to ignore the connection that my employers were making between my work and my body. So these personal experiences in the restaurant industry were really the catalyst that brought me to take on a PhD program and unpack how it is that these experiences of sexual harassment can become so normal. So as I mentioned, I use a socio-legal approach to studying sexual harassment to develop insight on law in its broader context. And I was inspired by the work of Dorothy Smith, sociologist Dorothy Smith, who worked on institutional ethnography, which is an emergent research approach that is concerned with how the world in which we live is put together. And it's one that really values experiences, and experiences are at the heart of research. So the way in which I then probe sexual harassment law and question legal definitions of sexual harassment law was informed by what I was learning in the interviews. Okay, fine, thank you. So some of the key arguments that come out of the work, well, actually, sorry, before I go through those, just as a general sense, the women that I interviewed shared stories of being hit on or stared at, and sometimes sexually touched by customers. They reported having to listen to accounts of a customer's sex life or remarks or questions about their own. They were subjected to, compliments, quote unquote compliments about their bodies and appearance. They faced sexist jokes and innuendo from customers, such as, "If you only knew what was going on in my head right now," or "I like it when you bend over." And dress codes and other appearance-based requirements also came up a lot in interviews. So gender-based dress codes that required women identified people to wear high-heel shoes or tight-fitting clothes or skirts, V-neck tops, jewelry, and even do their hair or makeup in specific ways. So the key findings that we'll go through in the rest of the presentation are that the way in which restaurant work is organized really produces an environment in which unwanted and uncomfortable sexual experiences and sexual harassment at work become embedded in the work. And this happens through a really quite a complex interaction between the social context of restaurant work, low and inadequate employment standards laws, workplace norms, and hiring and dress code practices. So restaurants are highly precarious work environments. And we'll get into this in a moment on what I mean by that. But employment standards laws in BC really set a bare minimum for workplaces, and restaurant workers rely on these employment standards laws because often they're not unionized. So the jobs are insecure, workers rely on tips, and again, the hiring practices are highly feminized and reflect gendered and sexist assumptions. Over time, being socialized in this environment, dealing with, putting up with, or going along with sexualized behavior is learned as a typical response. it becomes kind of embedded in the work, although not without protest. It's important to note that during my interviews with restaurant workers, there was a glaring absence of formal talk on the issue of sexual harassment. So when I asked people I interviewed and spoke with about whether or not there were any sexual harassment policies, or if they were ever given sexual harassment training, or if these experiences were handled in a formal way, my questions were met with very confident no's and sometimes laughter, as if it's so far-fetched that there would be a workshop that the restaurant as a group would take on sexual harassment. So precarious work. Go to the next slide. Oh, great, already there. Thanks, Sarah. So there's no single definition of precarious work, and there's been lots of public talk on precarious work, especially I know in Ontario with the review of the Employment Standards Act, the successes of the Fight for 15 and Fairness movement, and the adoption of a higher minimum wage and better employment standards. So there's lots of public talk on precarious work. And the notion is getting a lot more public attention. The definition of precarious work that I used in my research was inspired by the work of Judy Fudge and Leah Bosco. It can be thought of as work that is outside of what used to be the norm or the standard employment relationship. And the standard employment relationship captured employment situations that were often in unionized sectors. These relationships were highly regulated and usually involved full-time employment with a single employer. They provided an adequate wage and occupational benefits such as sick pay and health insurance. And in contrast to that, precarious work describes forms of work involving limited social benefits and statutory entitlements, little or low job security, low wages, a lot of health risks. And it can be shaped by employment status, form of employment, and other dimensions like income level and one's control over their own labor. And while precarious work has traditionally been an exception and traditionally been performed by people who didn't look like the white male breadwinner, precarious work has since grown to be the new norm. And in my research, precarious employment was a very useful conceptual tool for bringing attention to how employment and restaurant work enmeshed in relations of inequality such as race and gender and class is constructed to be precarious. It's not by accident. It is precarious work is socially constructed. And before I go into talking about the connection between precarious work and sexual harassment, I think it's important to point out that while full-service restaurant work in many ways is a model example of precarious work, precarity isn't new to the restaurant industry. With very few exceptions of unionized workplaces, restaurant work has generally always had precarious elements to it. So it's not new, it's not a new feature of the work, but precariousness in the industry has become intensified with policies and law that favor capital and the deregulation of labor. This next slide, I just chose this picture because I found it to be reminiscent of the concept where work is providing less and less of a foundation for people's lives. So when it comes to precarious work and sexual harassment, there isn't too much research that speaks to the relationship between the two. The first one here is a quantitative survey of workers in Australia. And it was actually conducted to look at the relationship between stress and precarious work, but researchers also noticed a connection between employment and unwanted sexual advances. So compared to permanent, full-time, own account, self-employed people, people who were in casual, full-time, and fixed-term contract employment relationships were strongly associated with higher frequencies of unwanted sexual attention, and women were significantly more likely than men to report these experiences. The second study mentioned here comes from Rogers and Henson, who have explored the topic of unwanted sexual attention and insecure work when looking at temporary work, and specifically temporary clerical workers. And they argued that sexual harassment was an outgrowth of the organization of the work and the work arrangements that were also embedded in gendered race and class processes, and cultural images that also sexualized temporary workers. So they looked at how power relations became intensified with unpredictable scheduling, the temporality of the work, the possible time off in between job assignments, the ability of an agency to terminate an assignment without notice, and the kind of overall low status of temporary workers were all features of temporary clerical work that limited a worker's opportunity for resisting sexual harassment. Just quickly, there's in the last few years, there's been more attention on precarious work and the potential human rights ramifications of precarious work. Research that comes out of the Poverty and Employment Precarity Group, Poverty and Employment Precarity in Southern Ontario Research Group, PEPSO, has shown an important connection between precarious work and our health, and the negative effects that precarious work has on our health when it comes to stress, anxiety, and depression. People who are precariously employed are more likely to face discrimination on the basis of race, gender, and age, and racialized workers are more likely to be precariously employed. So these are all of these bullet points relate to two really important studies that I encourage folks to check out if they're interested. One's called The Precarity Penalty, and the other is It's More Than Poverty, Employment Precarity, and Household Well-Being. Really great research reports. So what does restaurant work entail or look like? Studying restaurant work is important for many reasons. One, because it provides a lot of first jobs, and it is often a first experience of paid employment and introduces people to the world of paid work and norms of employment as well. We know that restaurant workers are young and that the work is gendered. Just to give you some data from BC, according to the 2006 long-form census, 41% of restaurant workers in the full-service restaurant industry were between 15 and 24. So 41%, that's enormous, really, given that people in the same age category make up just 16% of the overall labor force. And while stats can only collect data on people 15 to 24 or younger, I'd like to highlight that in British Columbia, the minimum legal work age is 12, as long as someone has the written consent of their parent, or under 12 with the permission of a parent and the permission of the Director of Employment Standards. And some of the people I spoke with began working in restaurants at the age of 14. Racialized workers are also overrepresented in restaurant work, although 23% of the labor force in BC is made up of visible minorities. Visible minorities represent 38% of restaurant workers in British Columbia. There's very little union presence in the restaurant industry. And because of this, workers rely on very low, inadequate employment standards laws, and these laws are commonly violated. So wage theft quite regular in the industry, and we'll get to that in a bit. Scheduling practices are insecure. And gender relations also shape the social organization of jobs in restaurants, so that jobs are both horizontally and vertically segregated by sex. So in BC, 68% of cooks and chefs are male, so in the back of the house, 58% of management and 73% of senior management are men, and 81% of food and beverage servers and hosts working in the front of the house that customers interact with are female. So we'll go to the next slide. The restaurant industry really can create these permanently temporary bad jobs. So in this first quote from Jackie says, "I guess you could call it an unspoken rule. If you don't like your job, there are 10 more people waiting for it." It's a very transient industry. There's a lot of turnover. People see other people go in and out of the door, and they know that, you know, there's other people waiting to drop off an application, and there's a lot of pressure that's felt by workers. The quotes here by Jill and Michelle demonstrate that how this temporality can be associated with restaurant work. It could be seen as a short-term thing. Like Jill says, "I just graduated, so I want to get a real job." And similarly, Michelle expresses how the word career and restaurant industry don't compute for her. She says, "It's not a job. I think when I'm having a bad," she says, sorry, "it's a job. I think when I'm having a bad day, I think to myself, it's not my life. It's a temporary thing that will get me to where I want to go." There's a lot of horizontal movement in the restaurant industry, and workers may not feel too secure at one place or get too attached because they can find work in another restaurant pretty easily. And this is, you know, one of the reasons why restaurant work is hard to unionize and hard to improve the working conditions. So getting in, so hiring and occupational organization is something I've talked about already. And here are just, you know, 2 quotes from Jill and Karen that really exemplify that. Jill says, "We're like a typical restaurant. We have girls in the front and guys in the back." And Karen, you know, in speaking about and describing where she worked and the front of the house, she said they were all women between 17 and 25, with the exception of 2 women who worked there who are in their 40s and single moms, and all Caucasian and very thin. So we see that the gendered and racialized hiring practices, and Saru Jayaraman from the US, from the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, does great work that shines a spotlight on this. And here's a really important quote from her that says, "Restaurant managers reserve their highest paying, most visible positions for white people, and workers of color are relegated to lower paying, invisible positions in the back of the house." So scheduling practices is another important element that makes restaurant work precarious. Oftentimes, workers' schedules are open-ended. They're also posted without much notice. Workers might be you know, expected to be on call, so they might have to call in an hour before their shift to see if they're working. And really, the working hours are very up in the air. So in this first quotation by Jen, you know, she speaks to this issue. She speaks to how she started work. She showed up for her first shift. It was open-ended. She didn't know how long it was going to be, and it ended up being like 9 hours. And the opposite can happen as well, where shifts are very short, and in these cases, the minimum daily pay requirements are frequently violated. And slide, I'm just going to, I think, skip this slide for now, being cognizant of the time, and go to the wage-tip relation. So these quotations I've selected because they highlight how significant tips can be to the income of servers and bartenders. We see the first quotation by Emily, who says, "Paychecks don't mean anything to me. I honestly forget I forget when I get paid." And if we think about this for a moment, I mean, the economic organization of restaurant work is such that Emily's income from her employer is really secondary to the tips she receives from customers. And the kind of same sentiment is echoed in Jill and Michelle's comments as well. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about tips. Essentially, tips are they're unpredictable, they're voluntary, they're given at the discretion of the customer, and they're paid after the labor is done. So really quite unique in that way when you think about how our labor or employment is paid. Tips can also vary. They depend on, you know, when you're scheduled to work, what shift you're working. And they also are, in some provinces like BC, Ontario, and Quebec, taken into account when setting the minimum wage regulations. So BC, for instance, has a liquor service minimum wage that is lower than the regular minimum wage because it accounts or takes into account the fact that customers are tipping. But if you think about this, and Enat Elvin does a lot of great work on this in showing how this kind of recognizes and legitimizes the role of a customer in what is essentially an employer function, right? That is like paying people for their work. So tipping and sexual harassment. The wage tip relation is a form of insecure income in the context of insecure work. It contributes to and reproduces expectations that restaurant workers feel to put up with unwanted sexual behavior and sexual harassment from customers. And when it comes to dealing with interactions with customers, keeping a customer going or playing along with their sexual behavior and listening to comments and innuendos and such are, you know, all a part of what is done, or the labor that's performed in order to receive a tip, essentially. In this first quote from Eve, we see how tipping practices can impact the work of hostesses. Even though hostesses aren't directly tipped by customers, they do benefit in tip pooling arrangements usually. And Eve, in this instance, explains what could happen if and when she would stop going along with, you know, what she was calling flirtation from customers. And this was a real example. And Eve says, when you would stop responding to it, they would go sour and they wouldn't tip well. And then the server would come up and be like, why didn't you keep him going? Why didn't he didn't leave a good tip? And it would almost leave a blame on you because you didn't, or you wouldn't continue the flirting. And Roxy shares, everybody knows that if you show a little more cleavage and you lean a little closer to someone, to people who are obviously looking for that kind of attention, and you talk to someone in a certain way, they're going to tip you more. You know, it's a weird thing, and I mean, it's so normal. And in this next quote from Amanda, who also worked as a server, she shared, I knew that if I acted in a certain way, or if I did certain things, that I was probably going to make more money. And so, you know, when you go into this industry, and I'm not saying that sexual behavior is a wanted thing necessarily at all, but when you go into this industry, you generally know that it's definitely going to be part of your job description is that you're going to get hit on. And the reliance that restaurant workers have on customers for tips, we see quite clearly, can leave workers vulnerable to enduring sexual harassment and sexualized interactions from customers as essentially the price to be paid for earning a tip. And this can be called institutionalized quid pro quo. Feminist scholar Catherine McKinnon and others have used the term quid pro quo sexual harassment to capture actions that you know, made connections between complying with sexual advances and employment quite explicitly. and where compliance is exchanged for an employment opportunity. And here we are, nearly 4 decades after quid pro quo was named, and one of the kind of most obvious and most egregious forms of sexual harassment is simply normalized in the restaurant industry. That is problematic, and also an interesting tension between the way in which law prohibits sex discrimination under human rights framework, but at the same time, employment standards legislation, including minimum wage laws that take account and legitimize tipping practices, enable these working conditions in restaurants that restrict how people react to sexual harassment. And for anyone who's worked in the industry, you'll be very familiar with this slide. And we've all heard the mantra that the customer is always right. And this first quotation, as it states, the customer is always right no matter what, and that's the culture. You have to suck it up, you have to accept it, it's part of the job. And Jenna explains, if I didn't do my job to try to make them happy, customers, I wouldn't have that job. And Karen, in this example from Karen, she told me that she responds politely to remarks or customers' comments that make her uncomfortable. And when I asked her why, she told me, I don't know, I have just my own personality. I'm not very standoffish, so I try to be polite in most situations. And I feel that because it's customer service and you want to make their evening or day enjoyable, so if you punish them, I feel like that would look poorly as a waitress. And that quotation is important because it kind of shows this expectation that's put on people in the service industry to be nice and to react to behavior from customers in a certain way. So the association between providing customers with good service and receiving a better tip kind of functions as an incentive to cater to customers and to accept customer behavior. And it's such a strong kind of there's such a strong customer service ethos in the industry. And when it's challenged by workers, there can be economic consequences, right? In that customers won't leave a tip. The next slide speaks to dressing practices that workers face in the industry. And again, like hiring practices, through dress codes, workers learn that their bodies or workers learn that their employers want their bodies and sexuality to be connected to their employment. And the first quote from Jen explains that the dress code in the place where she worked was gendered. And Jen says, all women that were required to wear a skirt or a dress. You were not allowed to wear pants. You can't wear any tights. If you were to wear nylons, they had to be sheer, and you had to wear high heels, at least 1 inch high. And restaurant employers also use the wage tip relation and the dependence workers have on tips to kind of leverage a discriminatory gender-based dress code policy. And dress codes where women have to wear high heel shoes and makeup and so forth, as I've already talked about. So as Karen describes, there's definitely that pressure to wear short skirts, lower tops, and be flirtatious, although that's not really my personality type, and all the time by customers, employers, and employees. And when she described how she felt pressured, she said that her manager would say that you'll make a lot of more money. And the final quote here is from Eve, who shared her experience working in a restaurant when she was 17, and she was directed to have plunging necklines, short hems, and told to show off her body. So I've spoken a lot about sexual harassment from customers and discriminatory hiring and dressing practices for management. And I wanted to end with a slide on kitchen talk. Kitchen talk was described to me in an interview with the hostess, and that's the first quotation here, where Eve says, in restaurants, there's something known as kitchen talk, lots of vulgar jokes, and you're talking mostly about vulgar sex in that. And I thought that this is important because it shows that this type of behavior is so, prominent that it has a name. It's just kitchen talk. Eve shared with me that in restaurants, Roxy shared that, she noticed in restaurants more than anywhere else that certain types of jokes that people do and the things they talk about, which are extremely sexist and racist, are not even questioned. This last quotation from Jackie, a former chef I interviewed, is really significant. Jackie says, if you're a female in the industry, you just accept what the guys do, otherwise you don't make it, you drop out. And that quotation is pretty powerful, and it shows how strong I think the culture can be. So I wanted to now take us into highlighting a few projects of resistance. And the first is called Fed Up. It stands for Feminist Eatery Database Undercover Project. And it was started about 2 years ago from a group of students in Alberta. And they started this blog, and it's a project that seeks to create a database of cafes and restaurants and reviews in order to develop what they call a feminist approach to eating out, highlighting prominent issues regarding gender, sex, and race in the service industry. And it's a blog where people can go and submit their anonymous reviews of places where they've worked. The next slide here, is just showcases a campaign in the United States, hashtag not on the menu. And I know it was actually picked up by a report in Ontario by the Human Rights Commission as well. And this is a campaign started from the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, the group where earlier I had mentioned Saru Jayaraman's amazing work, and that's Saru in the picture there on the megaphone. And it's a campaign that highlights the connection between living off tips and sexual harassment. And in the United States, the federal tip minimum wage is $2.13, and it's been frozen there for over 20 years. And the final slide, Project of Resistance, so comes from the Retail Action Network out here in Victoria. And it's the work that I do as an organizer in collaboration with many comrades and fellow organizers who have been working in the industry for many years or currently work in the restaurant and retail industry. And it's a grassroots direct action group that strives for improving work conditions in retail and restaurant work. We help workers develop worker-led direct action campaigns to put a spotlight on illegal workplace practices, wage theft, discrimination, bullying, and harassment in the workplace. And we also do a lot of educational work, workers' rights workshops, and advocate for systemic legal and policy change. Right now in BC, we're waiting on the Fair Wages Commission report, which will advise the government on the best way forward to a $15 minimum wage. And in our submission and presentation to the Commission, we highlighted the need to abolish the liquor servers minimum wage here and the connection between inadequate employment standards, protections, and vulnerability to sexual harassment in the workplace. So at an hour now, and I really love to hear from the folks who have been listening, your thoughts and questions, and also any of the projects you're working on out there as well. I'd love to hear more, and thank you for listening.
Kaitlyn, thank you so much for your presentation. And yes, indeed, we do have some questions. So I appreciate you keeping your remarks to the time frame so that you can respond to these questions. The first one that I want to share with you, Kaitlyn, is one of the participants expressed real surprise on the data you shared about the scheduling of shifts and the length of time. For instance, the research participant who talked about the 9 hours and no opportunity to eat, and then someone else coming in and it's a very, very short shift. And the question this is surprising to me, and what's the sample size of this information? Do we know how widespread that is, or is that just a more isolated problem?
Right. Yeah, really great question. So unfortunately, in British Columbia, the Employment Standards Branch, the section of the Ministry of Labor that is responsible for enforcing employment standards laws, doesn't keep great data and doesn't make data public on how common employment standards violations are in particular industries. So it was, it was across the board. I interviewed 20 people, and it was across, and those 20 people had worked in numerous restaurants, and it wasn't something that was unusual. And in my work at the Retail Action Network as well, working on the front lines and supporting retail and restaurant workers, violations around scheduling practices are also really common. One thing to point out, I guess, is that the employment standards laws in BC, when it comes to scheduling, are quite horrendous. So the minimum daily shift, which is the minimum amount that an employer must pay a worker if they're scheduled to work, is just 2 hours. And that was brought down from 4 hours in the early 2000s. So if you're scheduled to work, you go in and, it's not busy. What often happens is servers and bartenders are told, just wait at the bar. The floor is not busy enough to put you on. They wait there unpaid. And then if they're put on and it's not busy, they're sent home early. They are, the employer is required by law to pay people for 2 hours. But what we're seeing in those quotes from that slide that is common is that that's just something that isn't adhered to. It isn't adhered to, and there's problems around enforcement, but there's also problems with workplace norms around that. So it's thought of just the way that things are in the industry. It's not busy. I go home. Maybe my employer buys me a lunch instead of paying for my time. But yeah, so it's quite common.
Okay, thank you, Kaitlyn. Another question that's come in is, you've looked at human rights and employment standards frameworks. What about also using occupational health and safety frameworks, specifically risk management? A typical risk management focus is hazards to identify, eliminate, and control. And might sexually harassing behaviors be identified as hazards in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that someone brought that up. Thank you for that. Thank you for that point. I'm not sure what the protections in Ontario are like. When I started this research in 2011, the BC government introduced added protections in the occupational health and safety regulation that required employers to have a bullying and harassment program in place. And what this program involves is a policy and procedure manual, policy against harassment and bullying, and a formalized way in which someone is and can raise their concerns of bullying and harassment in the workplace. So that is there. There are limitations to it, though, unfortunately. Oftentimes the employer is actually the one who is the harasser. And so WorkSafe in BC, which enforces the occupational health and safety laws, requires that an employee must first bring their complaint to the workplace. And if the person who they have to complain to is someone harassing them, then that's a problem. But if they want to complain then to WorkSafe BC after that, their complaint isn't anonymous, and there's a lot of fear around doing that, and trying to keep your job. Yeah. So, but something that's developing, and I think it's a really interesting and possibly promising way to one of the angles to address the problem. So thanks. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Kaitlyn, another question. What advice do you have for individuals who have attended the Human Rights Tribunal with no favorable outcome due to lack of evidence, such as a video of the event, when these individuals are left with no justice?
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. What must be a very difficult experience. The cases that make it to be landmark cases, to get accepted and heard and have a favorable outcome, are often look like a certain type of case. They have exceptionally strong evidence. They, the first landmark cases that I pointed out earlier on one of those first slides, often the harassment was like physical sexual harassment, and there's strong cases with quotation marks in that sense. And I think the more common outcome is that it's that of disappointment. What advice would I have? Seek support from your coworkers or friends in solidarity, and perhaps if you want to work towards fixing or work towards challenging this problem, there are ways to do that in ways that can be quite transformative. Getting together with other workers and campaigning and bringing attention to the issue and demanding that government introduce educational workshops, such like what is going to be starting in Ontario.
Okay. Another question, Kaitlyn. What do we do about the restaurants that are particularly targeted to sexist patrons and behavior? And they offered an example such as a chain like Hooters.
Yeah.
In the US.
What do we do about them? Yeah, and that's a problem. And oftentimes those chains, Tilted Kilt is one, Hooters, they migrate up. Their franchisees migrate up from the U.S. And it's interesting. The U.S. has quite different sexual harassment laws. So I think franchises are used to operating in a different legal context, and then move them up here. And I think they can be challenged. I think if there are workers there who want to challenge the conditions of their work, that they can do so, and they should do so. And that challenge could look, take many different forms, from coming together and bringing public attention to it, calling for different workplace practices, fighting to unionize and change working conditions that way. Yeah, I think if there are workers at a place like Hooters that want things to be different, there are those options there.
Mm-hmm. If restaurant workers, Kaitlyn, were unionized, if that was one of the directions that was pursued, how might this change the work environment, and how might that change protect workers from sexual harassment?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think that, well, if you remember the case of Andrea Motu that I brought up earlier in the presentation, where she challenged the sexist and discriminatory dress requirement of wearing the bikini top, that was actually a unionized workplace. And again, I think that makes that case unique in its strength as well. When I was reading that decision, I read that she went home and called her shop steward and asked them what she should do about it, and complained to them and got their advice and support. And navigating a human rights system can be really daunting, disempowering, can be in such an individualized or feel like such an intimidating and individualized process. And I think unionizing can bring a collective support to that issue. Collective bargaining can also include the collective bargaining agreement that a union makes can also include specific provisions on sexual harassment and requirements for training and policies. And unionizing could also potentially create better working conditions. So all of those economic, or a lot of those economic power relations that shape such a precarious workplace could be addressed with better scheduling practices, regulation of tips, job security. Could bring job security, which I think could be huge in terms of how the issue is dealt with.
Another question someone's asking, and I can't help but think of one of the last slides that you showed in terms of the retail action group. But the question is, do you have examples of times when men have taken action to help challenge sexual harassment, and basically your thoughts on the role of men as allies in terms of preventing sexual harassment?
Yeah, absolutely. There are some examples that come to mind about men speaking out against sexual harassment in the restaurant industry. I can't give any concrete examples because none of those were really public campaigns, but I have seen it happen, and it does happen. And I think interjecting and challenging a coworker who engages in sexually harassing practices is so crucial. And oftentimes when those comments are said, one of the challenges that people I interviewed had was, and for anyone listening who's been in the restaurant industry, is that the work is so busy, and they're back, that waitresses are back there in the back of the house in the kitchen. They hear a remark from a coworker working the line or whatever, or a dishwasher, and they're running around. They have to run back out in the front of the house, and the pace of the work is such that those comments are said and then they walk away. But I mean, there really is a role of someone who's working alongside that person to call them out.
I'm afraid that we are out of time, and I want to formally thank you, Dr. Kaitlyn Matulewicz, for this really informative webinar. And I want to encourage everyone that participated. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions. And I want to encourage you, we will be sending out information about upcoming webinars, and definitely please try to join us for a future webinar on It's Your Shift. It's such a wonderful follow-up and building on the information that Kaitlyn has shared with us today. So again, there will be a link for a survey evaluation, which will help us plan as we go forward. And with that, again, thank you, Kaitlyn. I hope you're able to join us when It's Your Shift presents. We would look forward to that. And thank you to all participants. Bye.
Thank you.